Lesson 31. This is how philosophy will respond to the changing science of the scientific revolution that we discussed. Remember, we discussed Copernicus, Tycho, Kepler, Galileo, Isaac Newton, and we even mentioned how Newton liked a guy named Francis Bacon, his ideas. However, we haven't really discussed Francis Bacon too much. We're going to do that in this particular presentation. So the scientific revolution will force a reconsideration of philosophy. And Bacon and Descartes are going to be two individuals that we're really going to discuss as far as their attitude towards science, knowledge, truth, and their reaction to the past. They're going to be unhappy with scholasticism. They're going to see nature as a mechanism, as a machine. The use of mechanical metaphors will be used, these mechanical metaphors will be used to explain the world around us. So this kind of notion of a clockwork universe, like this piece of art here. They will begin to study nature more to control it than to try to kind of come up with some sort of insight about how to understand the divine. Remember, we discussed that in the Renaissance, that people started studying nature because they wanted to understand God's divine plan. And now you move into kind of a phase with the scientific revolution where they're just trying to harness the power of nature itself and conquer it. So here we see Francis Bacon. That's a dashing hat, if I do say so. And he's going to be the champion of the empirical method. He's an English lawyer, a politician, and a scholar. He is a father of the ideal of empiricism and experimentation. He's going to set the tone. He's not much of an experimenter himself. He doesn't do a lot of scientific observations. So, you know, it's kind of you have to be careful how you use this term of him being the father of empiricism or experimentation, since he didn't do much of it himself. He just talked about how awesome it would be for someone to do. He wrote the books The Advancement of Learning, Novum Organum, and The New Atlantis, which were very influential. So he attacked the belief that truth was already discovered. He didn't believe that the ancients had it all figured out. He championed innovation to improve the human condition. So here we get this really good, strong sense of progress and the idea that people can figure things out and make their world better. He believed in examining evidence before you speculate about some sort of solution to a particular question about science. He compared himself to Columbus, whereas Columbus was this explorer of geography. Bacon was, in his opinion, an explorer of how to arrive at the truth, an intellectual explorer. Now, most people believe that the golden age on Earth was in the past, and Bacon believed that there was going to be some sort of future golden age. Again, this idea of progress. So science, in his opinion, has become the major force for change, and Bacon will link science with the monarchy and with government institutions, and the idea of the government furthering, sponsoring science. And in fact, that's what happened. There was a close relationship between governments and scientific experimentation. Rene Descartes, he's the other guy to consider here. He is the guy who comes up with the method of rational deduction. He'll invent analytic geometry, which I know very little about. I remember something about coordinates and graphs when I was in high school, and here we see something like that. His scientific method was based on deduction, not induction, like Bacon's. So he argued you reason from general principles that you know to be true to come up with kind of a general idea, and then you apply it to specific issues. And then you might observe things to see if you're right. In 1637, he writes Discourse on Method in French to get more people to read it, and it advocated thought in thinking on a kind of a mathematical model. However, his deductive reasoning, for many of the reasons Newton didn't like it, will lose out to scientific induction. The idea of find a problem, do a lot of observations, come up with some sort of explanation, and then test and experiment to see if you've got it figured out. And that's not Descartes' system. Here we see Descartes, not exactly Brad Pitt. He had some other ideas. He was a skeptic in a sense, a philosophic skeptic. He wanted to doubt everything but what he had a clear and distinct idea for. So he's the guy, cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am. He proved his own existence, and from there he worked up a complicated philosophical proof to explain God's existence. He also emphasized in his philosophy the idea that the world of the mind and the world of the body are kind of separate. In a way, he argued that really what he knew to be true was more the world of the mind than the world of the body. And it gets a little kind of complicated. I don't have time to explain this in this YouTube presentation, and this is pretty deep philosophy. Unfortunately for you, if you're not interested in it, you don't need to know that much about Descartes' philosophy for this course. Now we move on to Thomas Hobbes. He's the apologist for absolute government, as your book says. He hung out with Descartes for a little while. He hung out with Galileo for a little while. Over here is a picture of his book cover, or I'm not sure it's the cover. It might be the inside front piece. And he's a philosopher. He is a classicist. He will experience the English Civil War, which will lead him to write his book, The Leviathan, in 1651, which pushed his ideas for supporting absolute government. He viewed society in a mechanistic way, in a machine-like way, much like these other figures that we've just studied. And he will try to justify a strong, central, absolute government. He's going to regard all human motives as selfish and material. So this is in contradiction to some of these other guys that we're going to be studying. And he's going to argue that there is a social contract with the ruler. People have a social contract with the ruler to limit their pursuit of self-interest, which will lead to conflict. So he argued that there was equality in a natural state before this contract with the ruler that led to a lot of conflict. And now he argues this not in the historical sense, but in a philosophical sense. He argues this is kind of the state of how things were before governments were formed. He doesn't argue that he has a certain date and a certain time when this stuff happened. And so he's this famous quotation from his book, The Life of Man, Solitary, Poor, Nasty, Brutish, and Short, referring to this state of nature. So the use of force is necessary because people are selfish to enforce this social contract, to keep people from picking on each other, essentially. He believes anarchy, because it reduces everything to this state of nature again, is always worse than tyranny, and he argues that absolute authority could be located, lodged in either a monarch or in a legislature, and this means he's going to get a lot of resistance from almost everybody. Monarchists are going to object to the fact that he says it's okay for the legislature to have absolute authority. Republicans, who are, pro-legislature, are going to be upset with him because he says it's okay for the monarch to have absolute authority. He just wants a government that has a lot of power, basically, and he doesn't care which form it is. And this is going to upset pretty much everybody in one way or another. Many Christians will criticize his argument as being too materialist, and some will criticize him for his refusal to speak of a divine right of kings to rule. So because he leaves Christian explanations out. This is one of the revolutionary things about his work. It's one of the reasons why his work is so original, but it's also one of the reasons why it had little immediate impact in his society. It's going to have more force, more influence down the road. So here we come to his opposite number in a way. John Locke, the defender of moderate liberty, and it's cut off by the image of him, but tolerance. He is the most influential 17th century thinker, and he sets the foundation for liberal political philosophy, which is, very much an influence in American political philosophy. He has Puritan sympathies. Before the Glorious Revolution, he is a buddy of a guy named Shaftesbury who tries to plot a rebellion, which forces John Locke to, when it doesn't work out, he has to flee to Holland. So right after the Glorious Revolution, in 1690, these two books he's written, two treatises on government, he can now publish them, so let's see what those are about. They're very influential in terms of political philosophy, both in Europe and in the United States. So his first treatise effectively rejected absolutism based on patriarchy. One of the arguments people made for an absolute monarch was kind of that it's the natural order of things. The king is kind of like a father to everyone. And basically, if you read the first treatise, he just tears that argument completely up. It gets abandoned. Nobody tries to use that argument anymore. No serious philosopher. The second treatise is his book on the social contract. Here he argues, unlike Hobbes, who thinks the natural state is this horrible thing, he argues it's a state of freedom and equality, where people are reasonable and there's a general sense of goodwill. People have a natural right to life, liberty, and property. You might think of this in terms of Jefferson, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. So in the social contract that he develops, unlike Thomas Hobbes' social contract, he argues that in this natural state, where things are actually pretty decent, there is some modest competition and conflict. Not great amounts of competition and conflict, not some horrible, hellish existence like Hobbes argues, but there's some competition and conflict which requires government to sort out those problems. People enter into a contract to preserve what he views as self-evident natural rights. In other words, these natural rights existed before there was a government, and this limits the authority of the government, because the government isn't the reason you have those rights, under Locke's conception of how this works. The conflict lies in rulers who threaten natural rights. He argues that a ruler who does this breaks the contract because his job is to protect people's natural rights. And when he's a tyrant and he oppresses natural rights, he breaks the contract, and like any other contract, people have the right then to ignore the contract, set up a new contract, which means that they have a right to rebel and replace their ruler. And check it out. One of the countries that was inspired by Locke's arguments on social contract was the United States of America. Here we see good old George Washington crossing the Delaware. In 1689, he writes, it publishes the letter concerning toleration. This is actually a year before the two treatises. Government exists to preserve life, liberty, and property, not to deal with religion. So he's arguing that religious ideas religious issues are not something the government needs to sweat too much. And he also argued that you can't really save somebody by forcing them to say what you want to hear. So coercing people to agree to certain religious ideas doesn't work anyway. However, I mean, he's not a total modern free thinker. He does question the loyalty of Catholics in Britain, believing that they're loyal to the Pope and loyal to Catholic rulers on the continent. And he doesn't trust atheists, because from his perspective, they don't really have any kind of moral framework with which to build any kind of laws that govern their behavior. In 1690, he's busy in 1689 and 1690. He publishes the essay concerning human understanding. He believes that the mind is a blank slate at birth. This is in Latin tabula rasa. And he believes you can improve the human condition with positive environment, because the brain takes in, as you grow up, you sense things, you take in experiences, and that develops your personality, according to Locke. This is kind of he's almost the father of modern psychology. And so, make a good environment, give people good input, they become good people. Now this rejects original sin, but he does not reject divine revelation in Scripture, as long as it's tempered with reason. So he's not going to be, not everybody who is religious is going to be a fan of him, and many Protestant Christians are not going to be happy, or Catholic Christians for that matter, with his idea of rejecting original sin.